In the bloody summer of 1863, the land itself seemed to breathe smoke and sorrow. Fields, once green, were now endless seas of broken bodies and shattered weapons. The cries of the wounded carried for miles, and men on both sides felt the weight of death pressing close, as if the air itself had turned heavy with doom. It was in this atmosphere of blood and fear that whispers began to spread. Whispers of a wandering pastor who appeared where the shadows of war gathered. He was not a man anyone could place in rank or regiment. No one recalled seeing him march or rest. Yet somehow he was there, always on the eve of battle, stepping out from the mist or the ruined shells of churches, his figure gaunt, his coat frayed, his Bible clutched tight against his chest. The soldiers at first thought him a blessing, a man of God come to bring comfort before death. His voice when he spoke was like a hammer against the soul. Each word struck with such force that men found themselves trembling. Some swore he looked straight into their hearts, as if he knew the sins they carried, as if he could already measure the weight of their final judgment. He spoke not of mercy or forgiveness, but of fire and blood, of graves already dug, and of eternity waiting just beyond the horizon. Men who heard him claimed that when he raised his hands, the very winds seemed to pause. The camp would fall silent. Fires would crackle, but the sparks rose no higher. The night would grow cold, and in that stillness, he would declare that no man could outrun the fate written upon him. Soldiers found their breath stolen, their courage shaken. Some felt stronger, others felt doomed, but all agreed that when he preached, the world around them grew thin and strange, as if time itself held its breath. And then came the battles, the moments when thousands clashed and screams filled the air. Survivors swore that the preacher had known the outcome. He had looked upon their faces and seen which would be corpses in the mud and which would stagger home broken. Those who died had heard his warnings in their last hours. Those who lived said his words haunted them long after they left the field. But who was he? No officer could answer. No roll call carried his name. No chaplain reported his presence. He belonged to no army, yet walked among both Union and Confederate camps alike, and strangely neither side stopped him. Men who had every reason to kill on sight simply let him pass, as if some invisible power shielded him, as if bullets and bayonets could not touch his skin. As the war dragged on, the stories deepened. Some said his eyes glowed in the firelight. Others claimed he cast no shadow. When the moon was bright, a few swore that animals fell silent when he drew near, that dogs would whimper, that horses would rear in terror. Once a private from Pennsylvania wrote in his diary that he woke in the night to see the preacher standing over him, the Bible open to a page that glowed, though no lamp was lit. The preacher whispered only one line, "Your time is not yet," and then vanished into the darkness. No man ever saw him eat. No one saw him sleep. He seemed untethered to the needs of flesh and blood. He came only to speak, and then to fade, and with each appearance death soon followed. In greater measure, regiments that heard his sermons bled heavily in the days after, and so rumors grew that he was no servant of God at all, but a phantom, a herald of doom sent to prepare men not for heaven, but for the grave. Still there were those who listened willingly, desperate for any sign in that hell of a war. And so the legend spread until the night of his final sermon. It was July 1863. The air thick with the thunder of cannons outside Gettysburg. A ruined church stood blackened by fire, its bell long since fallen, its windows shattered there beneath the fractured roof. Soldiers huddled weary and afraid when he appeared again, walking through the broken doorway as if he belonged to the ruins. His Bible pressed to his chest, his eyes darker than ever before he climbed the cracked pulpit, though no voice had rung from it for years, and began to speak. They said his words were sharper than bayonets, every syllable cutting into their minds. He spoke of the earth itself drinking blood and never being full. He spoke of graves that called to the living, He spoke of voices that would never stop screaming in the soil. He told them plainly that none would escape the harvest of death, and the soldiers listened frozen, unable to move. Some whispered prayers, some wept openly. None could turn away. And then he stopped. He closed the Bible and looked out upon them, his gaze sweeping across each face slowly, deliberately, as if sealing their fates one by one. And then, without another word, he stepped down and walked into the smoke of battle that rolled like a tide across the field. They expected him to return. They expected to hear his voice again, but he never came back. The preacher was gone. Men searched, after the fight, combing through the dead looking for him, but they found nothing. No body, no coat, no trace of his Bible. Only silence lingered in the shattered church, and the memory of his final words haunted every survivor who lived to recall that night. So who was the phantom preacher? Was he a man, broken by war, drifting from camp to camp? Was he a spy cloaked in scripture? Or was he something far stranger? A shadow born from the blood of a nation tearing itself apart? The truth vanished with him in that smoke of 1863, and all that remains are the stories, the trembling accounts of men who swore he was real, and who swore that death always followed wherever he spoke. The war was at its peak. The land stretched wide with scars of cannon, fire and smoke, the air heavy with the stench of powder and decay. Each night the skies lit with strange flashes, distant thunder blending with the roar of guns. Soldiers knew no rest, for even in silence the dread of death pressed close. It was on one such stormy night, when rain lashed tents and lightning ripped through clouds, that a figure approached the Union camp. A ragged preacher, or so the men called him, though no one recognized his face, and no officer could say from where he came. His coat hung loose, torn at the seams and caked with mud. His boots looked near ruined, as if he had walked for years without pause. His hair fell long, matted by rain, yet his eyes burned like fire pits, unquenched. They were the only light in his gaunt, starving face, and when he stepped into the glow of the campfires, men fell silent. Conversations died. Cards were dropped. Laughter ceased, as if every voice in the camp was stolen by the storm itself. He carried a Bible clutched so tightly, his knuckles looked pale as bone. Though the storm raged, his voice when he spoke was louder than thunder. It carried across the camp without strain, as if the sky itself lent him its force. Each word struck like a drumbeat upon the soldiers' hearts. His tone was not gentle nor merciful, but fierce, a cry against the darkness that demanded every ear. Listen, some soldiers said, his eyes pierced through them like nails. One young private swore later that when the preacher's gaze fixed upon him, he felt his sins laid bare, felt as though the man already knew the hour of his death. Others claimed the air grew colder around him, that the firelight dimmed as he passed, and yet none could turn away. They were trapped, caught in the spell of his voice. He spoke of war not as men saw it, but as a divine furnace, a place where souls were tried and weighed. He said the fields already drank too much blood, but would demand more. He warned that the ground itself would not rest until it swallowed them whole. His words rolled like waves across the weary men, drowning their doubts and feeding their fear, and still none dared to stop him. A sergeant whispered later that the storm itself seemed to obey the preacher when his voice rose, lightning cracked when his tone fell, thunder rolled as if creation itself answered his sermon. Some men crossed themselves. Others dropped to their knees, shaking between belief and terror. Who was this man? No soldier could say he wore no badge of rank, no insignia of faith beyond the Bible in his hands. No chaplain had ever seen him before, and yet he strode into the camp as though it belonged to him. The guards at the perimeter swore they had not seen him approach one moment. The night was empty the next. He was there, alone, shadow at the edge of the firelight. Rumors began at once. Was he a lost minister wandering the battle lines to bring God to the doomed? Was he a madman driven by visions? Or worse, was he something not of flesh? At all men debated in whispers, yet none dared confront him to demand answers. Fear chained their tongues, for, though he looked frail, half-starved, even broken, there was an unshakable force in his presence, an authority no mortal should wield. The storm raged on, and the preacher raised his hands high above him. His Bible opened, the pages somehow dry, though rain poured like a flood. The words he spoke could not be mistaken. He promised them death, not in years, not in decades, but soon, he said, they marched toward the mouth of eternity, and no man among them would escape the reckoning. Those who trembled swore. Later they saw shadows gather behind him, shapes that flickered like lost souls clinging to his coat, though none could say if it was trick of lightning or something darker. And then, as suddenly as he had arrived, he was gone. When the storm broke and the first light of dawn spread across the ruined fields, the preacher was nowhere to be found. No footprints marked the mud where he had stood. No cloak, no book, no trace of a man at all, and yet every soldier in that camp swore they had seen him, heard him, felt his words like iron nails driven into their souls. Days later, when the regiment marched into battle, they suffered grievous losses. Whole companies fell under. Firemen remembered his words as they bled into the dirt. Some said he had cursed them. Others believed he had foretold their fate. Either way, his presence became a shadow over every survivor. The preacher who came from nowhere spoke of their deaths and vanished into storm and smoke. His name was never learned, his origins never traced. Some said he was a ghost born of the war itself, a spirit feeding upon despair. Others believed he was a man cursed to wander until every battlefield had claimed. His sermon all agreed on one thing wherever he appeared. The shadow of death soon followed, and so the question remained, who was this man? Was he of God or of something far darker? He preached of blood sacrifice and eternity, his voice rolling across the campfires like thunder. His words poured into the men like molten iron. Some said they felt stronger, hearing him. Others swore. Their souls trembled as if he spoke from the mouth of the grave. He did not promise them victory. He promised them only that their blood would be remembered by the earth, and that eternity waited for each of them just beyond the smoke of tomorrow. The soldiers listened, unable to look away. He stood ragged, his coat torn, his cheeks hollow, but his eyes blazed with a light no storm could quench. He spoke of sacrifice not as a noble offering, but as a demand, a debt the war itself required. He told them the fields drank deep of men, and still thirsted for more, and that those who marched with courage would be swallowed. All the same, the fire snapped and hissed at his feet, but he seemed untouched by heat or rain. He looked like a man of bone and fire, both frail and immortal. One corporal whispered later that it felt less like a sermon and more like judgment. Every phrase struck like a verdict, sealing fates before they were lived. Another swore the preacher named no names yet. Each soldier felt certain he had spoken directly to him, calling out his sins, his cowardice, his secret fears. One man claimed the preacher's eyes lingered on him too long, and he fled the circle only to be found dead on the field. The very next day, rumors spread instantly. Some said he was a prophet, others a phantom in borrowed flesh. A few dared say he was no preacher at all, but the hand of death itself come to gather his harvest. They argued in hushed tones, but none dared approach him to ask for truth. He stood apart, his Bible pressed to his chest, his gaze fixed not on the living, but somewhere beyond, as if he already looked upon the fields where blood would be spilled. The night stretched long, the storm rolled overhead. The men returned to their tents, but none slept easily. They dreamed of graves, of open mouths in the earth, waiting to swallow them, of sermons whispered in the dark that they could not silence. And when morning broke, the regiment marched forward into the teeth of war. The preacher was gone. vanished with the storm as though he had never been. And yet his words clung to their minds like chains. The battle that followed was merciless. Cannon thunder shook the sky. Smoke choked the lungs. Men fell in waves, torn apart by musket fire and shrieking steel. And as the blood spilled into the mud, soldiers swore they remembered the preacher's voice echoing. In the chaos, one man gasping his last breath swore aloud that he heard the sermon again, each syllable booming across the carnage, promising eternity and sacrifice. And then he died with the words on his lips. When the sun fell, the regiment lay shattered. Dozens gone, their bodies scattered across the field. Survivors crawled back, broken wide-eyed, haunted by what they had heard the night before. They whispered among themselves the preacher had told them they would not return, and so it had come to pass. No strategy, no courage, no faith had spared them. The preacher had seen it already. Was it prophecy or curse? The officers could not answer. They recorded the losses, but not the whispers. They dismissed it as superstition. Yet the men believed, and belief is a chain stronger than iron. They began to watch the night, dreading his return, for they knew if the preacher appeared again, it meant another grave, another harvest of blood. Some wrote of it in diaries. One private recorded that the preacher's voice still haunted his ears, like a hymn sung backwards. Another confessed he prayed not for victory, but that he might never hear that voice again. And yet deep within each survivor was a twisted certainty that they would see him again, for war did not end, and wherever death walked, the preacher seemed bound to follow. So who was he? The question burned in every mind. Was he a man gifted with visions of death, cursed to see the end of every soldier before it came? Or was he a shadow of the war itself, an embodiment of sacrifice and eternity, born from the endless graves? Perhaps he was neither. Perhaps he was both. Whatever he was, the truth was undeniable. He had spoken of blood. He had spoken of sacrifice. He had spoken of eternity. And by the next morning, dozens were gone. Their lives poured into the earth exactly as he had promised. And so the legend deepened, a phantom preacher, walking among men on the eve of their deaths, leaving behind only silence, loss, and a question that no one could answer. Was he a man of God? Or was he something else entirely? Survivors began whispering whenever the preacher spoke. Death followed. It was not coincidence. They said it was not chance. Men who had stood in the circle of his sermon fell. In the next battle, their faces pale, their eyes wide, as if they had already seen their end before the bullets found them. And those who lived carried his words like wounds that never healed. Was he blessing them with courage to face their fate, or was he cursing them, sealing their doom with each syllable no man could decide? But all knew the truth. Death walked behind him like a shadow. Officers tried to dismiss it. They called it superstition, the ramblings of frightened men. But even the hardened captains noticed the pattern. Each regiment that heard him bled heavier than the rest. It was as though his presence drew battle closer, as if he marked the ground for slaughter before a single shot was fired. Still none could explain him. He was not on any roster. No chaplain knew his name. No officer had given him orders, and yet he appeared in their camps, moving freely, as though the war itself allowed him. Passagemen began to ask one another, had anyone seen him eat? Had anyone seen him sleep? Not a soul could recall. He never shared bread by the fire, never took water from the barrels, never rested on the ground like the weary. Instead, he drifted silent among them, sometimes with Bible in hand, sometimes with empty eyes staring into. The night soldiers swore they had seen him standing in the rain, unmoving until dawn, when others rose, shivering from their tents. They would find him gone, leaving only the echo of his words. The whispers deepened into fear. One soldier said he saw The preacher in two camps at once. A Union scout swore he had glimpsed him across enemy lines, the very same night, standing among the Confederates delivering the same sermon of blood and sacrifice. How could that be unless he was more than a man? Another diary spoke of seeing him at dusk on a ridge, watching silently as two armies clashed below his form, blurred by mist, his hands folded as though in prayer. Yet no one could recall him ever praying with the men, not once. That was the strangest part. He carried the Bible always pressed against his chest, and yet he never joined in prayer when the chaplains called for worship. He stood apart, silent, watching when men knelt before battle. He did not kneel when they sang hymns. He did not open his mouth. The words that left his lips were his own dark sermons, not of comfort, but of judgment. He spoke as though heaven itself was silent and only the earth hungered. One private swore he woke in the middle of the night and saw the preacher walking through the camp, the fires burning low, the men asleep. The preacher moved without sound, not stirring the gravel, not snapping the twigs beneath his boots. The private called out softly, but the preacher did not turn. Instead, he walked on until he reached the far edge of the camp where the fog was thickest, and there he vanished as though swallowed by the mist. Others said his face changed in the firelight, sometimes younger, sometimes older. Once a soldier claimed his eyes were bright and fierce. Another swore they were empty black pits that reflected no flame. How could so many see so many different things unless he was no ordinary man? Unless he was something else wearing the mask of a preacher? And so the camps began to fear not only the battles but the nights before them. For each night the question hung heavy. Would the preacher appear? Would his voice echo through the tents? Would his eyes fall upon them, sealing their fate? For if he spoke, then death would follow. And the men knew it. They felt it in their bones. Still no officer could stop him. They ordered guards at the perimeter, and yet he appeared within the circle of firelight. Without any challenge, they commanded scouts to track him, but none returned with an answer. They asked the chaplains who searched their rolls and papers, but no name, no history matched. He was no man of the church. They knew no record bore his existence. So who was he? A wandering prophet, cursed with visions, a ghost bound to the fields of war, a demon clothed in scripture. The men argued in whispers around their fires, but the truth was simpler and far darker. He was the phantom preacher, the one who came before blood was spilled, the one who spoke of eternity, the one who left men trembling before they even faced the enemy, and the one who vanished when his work was done. He did not bless them. He did not curse them. He simply was. And wherever he stood, the shadow of death soon followed. Weeks later, the war dragged on, and the earth itself seemed tired of drinking blood. Yet the guns roared, the drums beat, and the men marched until they were broken and remade in fire. It was then the whispers began again. For the preacher had returned, not to the Union camp this time, but to the Confederates. They saw him as clearly as the Union men had a ragged figure emerging from the mist, his coat in tatters, his hair hanging in wet strands, his eyes glowing with the same terrible fire, and his Bible clutched like a weapon. They swore his voice rose above the storm, above the clash of steel, above even the cannons. His sermon was the same words of blood sacrifice and eternity, words that chilled the bones of the soldiers who gathered round. Some thought him a blessing sent to strengthen their resolve. Others saw in his eyes the emptiness of a grave and felt their courage drain away. For it was not hope he gave them, but inevitability. The strange thing none could explain was how he walked freely through their lines. No guard challenged him. No officer questioned him. Men swore he was simply there one moment, absent the next. And when he stood before them, all else seemed to fade, as though the world itself bent to his presence. There were even whispers that Union scouts watching from afar saw him too. His form, unmistakable, even in distance, and yet no shot was fired, no musket raised, no bullet dared to touch him. And then the battle came, and the Confederates bled, as the Union men had bled. Their ranks shattered, their bodies scattered across the mud. Survivors swore they heard his voice echoing in the thunder of guns, promising them eternity, calling them to the sacrifice that could not be escaped. They remembered his gaze and felt he had already chosen who would fall and who would crawl back alive. The officers dismissed it as fear, as coincidence. Yet the pattern was undeniable wherever he appeared. Devastation followed, no matter the flag, no matter the side. His sermons were impartial, his warnings universal. Death did not distinguish between blue and gray, and neither, it seemed, did the phantom preacher. And so a new question spread like fire. How could one man walk freely through enemy lines untouched in a war where brother turned upon brother, where spies were hanged and deserters shot? Yet this man wandered among them, both Union and Confederate alike, and was spared as if war itself recognized him and bowed to his passage. Some soldiers whispered he was not a man at all, but an angel of death, a messenger bound to no nation. Others said he was the devil himself, sowing despair on both sides, watching the earth fill with blood and laughing in silence. Still others believed he was the ghost of a long-dead chaplain, doomed to walk until every soul in the war had been claimed. The strangest testimony came from prisoners. Union soldiers captured swore they saw him standing beside Confederate officers, his head bowed as if listening. And days later, Confederate men swore they saw him in Union tents, whispering to generals. How could he be in both places unless he was more than flesh? One man even swore he saw the preacher crossing the battlefield at dusk, his figure moving calmly between the fire of both sides, musket balls tearing the air, cannons shattering the ground, yet not one shot struck him. He walked as if the chaos parted for him, as if death itself refused to touch its own. Herald, fear grew heavier with every tale. Men prayed, not for victory, but that they would not hear his sermon, for those who heard him seemed marked, and those who were marked rarely returned the same when they did return. Their eyes were hollow, their voices thin. They carried his words like chains and spoke of him in whispers, as if too loud a voice might summon him again. The legend of the phantom preacher grew. He belonged to no army, wore no colors, spoke no oath. And yet his presence commanded more weight than any general. He crossed lines as though lines meant nothing to him, as though war itself was his congregation and the fields of dead his church. And still the question haunted them all. How could one man walk freely through enemy lines untouched? Perhaps he was not walking through at all. Perhaps he did not travel in ways men understood. Perhaps he simply appeared where the harvest of death was richest, called by the scent of blood and fear. Perhaps he was not a preacher wandering the war, but the war itself given form. Whatever he was, Union and Confederate alike carried the same memory, a thin, starving man, with burning eyes, a voice like thunder, and a sermon that bound their fates, and wherever he spoke, devastation followed, as surely as night followed. Day he always appeared before battles and always vanished. Before the smoke cleared, no one ever saw him fight, no one ever saw him flee. He was simply there when the air grew heavy, when the drums beat low and the men braced for death. Then when the chaos erupted, when the ground shook with cannon thunder, when muskets roared and men fell in heaps, he was gone as if the storm had swallowed him. Whole soldiers on both sides swore they saw him walking calmly across the fields of fire, his tattered coat flapping in the wind, his Bible clutched to his chest. Shells exploded around him. Musket balls tore the air, yet none touched him. One witness, a Union private, claimed he saw the preacher cross directly through a line of advancing soldiers. The men parted without thought, without order, as though compelled, and the preacher walked between them, untouched, vanishing into smoke. Another Confederate officer swore he saw him step through cannon fire, the blast tearing men to pieces around him, while the preacher strode forward, unflinching, his lips moving as if in prayer or curse. Though no one could hear the words. The battlefield was chaos, screaming blood, mud, and fire. Yet the preacher moved as if it were a quiet chapel, as if the screams were hymns and the thunder of guns was an organ song. His calmness was the most terrifying thing of all. Men clung to rage or fear to survive. But he bore neither. His face was hollow, his eyes burning, but his step steady. Not once did he stumble. Not once did he flinch. He belonged in that storm as though he had been born from it. And always, always, when the smoke cleared, he was gone. The wounded lay gasping, the dead piled silent, the survivors broken in spirit, but the preacher nowhere. No footprints, no body, no trace, as if the battle itself had consumed him and left nothing behind, except memory and fear. So was he real, or just a ghost born from fear? Men asked the question in whispers around dying fires. If he was real, why did no bullet strike him? Why did no blade pierce him? If he was flesh, how did he vanish without a trace? Why did no officer ever capture him? Why did no roll ever name him? And if he was a ghost, how did so many see him in the same moment? How did his voice cut through the storm, louder than thunder, yet sharp as a whisper in the earth? The men tried to explain it. Some said he was madness, given form, a trick of minds broken by war, that fear itself conjured him to give shape to the death that followed. Others said he was a phantom, not of one man, but of many, a spirit born from the cries of thousands bound to walk the fields forever, warning of blood and sacrifice and eternity. Some swore he was a punishment from God, a reminder that war was sin, and that those who marched to kill would meet judgment not in heaven but in the soil beneath their feet. Still there were those who believed he was flesh and bone, a man cursed with visions, a prophet who walked the lines of both armies offering warnings. They could not escape. One chaplain wrote in his journal that perhaps the preacher was chosen not to save men, but to show them the futility of war, that his sermons were not curses but mirrors, reflecting the truth of their fate, and that the reason no bullet struck him was because no bullet dared to silence what was already ordained. But such thoughts gave no comfort, for comfort died wherever he appeared. Men came to dread the nights before battle more than the fighting itself, not for the enemy, not for the guns, but for the sound of that voice rolling over their camp, telling them the ground was thirsty, telling them eternity was near, telling them that sacrifice was demanded and that none would escape its call. And then as dawn broke, they marched into slaughter, and when the smoke cleared, he was gone again. Only bodies remained. Only silence remained. Only questions remained. Was he real, or was he a ghost born from fear? The legend grew. With each telling, soldiers swore they could still feel him, even when he did not appear, a presence in the fog, a weight in the air, as if he lingered unseen, watching, waiting, his sermons echoing in their minds long after his form had faded. They said he lived not in flesh, but in memory. And memory was stronger than bullets. And so the preacher became more than a man, more than a ghost. He became the shadow of the war itself, a figure who walked calmly across fields of fire. Never struck, never harmed, never bound by the rules of men, he belonged to death, and wherever death reigned, he was at home. In July 1863, the land shook with thunder, not only from the storm, but from the clash of armies at Gettysburg. The sky burned with fire. The hills trembled beneath the boots of tens of thousands, and death swept through the fields like a tide. Men spoke later that the air itself tasted of iron and smoke, and that no prayer could rise above the roar of cannons. It was here, on the edge of that inferno, that a ruined church stood, its roof caved in, its windows shattered, its bell long since fallen silent, as soldiers gathered, weary and broken, seeking shelter from the storm of steel. They saw him again, the ragged preacher, stepping from the mist, as if the earth itself had pushed him forward, his coat torn, his hair clinging to his face. his eyes burning brighter than ever, before he moved through them without a word until he reached the shattered pulpit. The wood cracked and blackened by fire, and there he climbed as though it had been waiting for him for centuries. The men fell silent. None ordered it, yet silence fell all the same. The preacher opened his Bible, the pages unmarked by soot or rain, and began to speak, his voice deeper than they had ever heard before, like the earth itself was speaking through him. He did not speak of courage nor of salvation. He spoke of blood, of sacrifice, of the endless hunger of the land. He said, "This land drinks blood, and it will never be full." His words tore through them like knives. Men shivered, though the night was already cold. Some dropped to their knees. Others clutched their weapons tighter as though they might shield themselves from the weight of his voice. Witnesses swore his eyes glowed with a light. No fire cast that when he spoke, the broken glass in the windows rattled as if struck by an invisible hand. One soldier said he saw shadows gathering behind him, shapes of men, women, even children, faces, pale eyes, hollow, standing in rows like a congregation of the dead listening to their eternal pastor. Another swore the storm itself answered him, that lightning cracked in time with his words and thunder rolled like an amen. He told them the earth was not their enemy nor their ally. It was their grave. He told them the fields would never rest until they had consumed every drop of blood. He told them eternity waited in silence, not in glory, not in victory, not in peace, but silence endless and suffocating. And when he said these things, men felt their souls tremble, for though no enemy stood before them, they knew in their hearts that his words were true. They would die. They would feed the land, and the land would demand Moreno. One dared interrupt, no. One dared look away. His sermon was not long, but each word felt carved into stone, each phrase echoing deeper than memory. The soldiers later admitted they could not forget it, even if they tried. The words returned in dreams, in waking thoughts, in the sound of the wind or the crack of gunfire. This land drinks blood, and it will never be full. And then, without warning, he closed the Bible. His hand resting upon its cover, he swept his gaze across the men. Each one felt his eyes pierce straight through their flesh into the marrow of their bones. He held their gaze one by one, as if measuring them, as if counting them, as if preparing to inscribe their names into a book unseen. When at last his eyes lowered, he stepped down from the pulpit and walked into the mist. The men expected him to return, as he always had before they waited through the night listening for his voice. But it never came. They searched the ruins of the church, but found no footprints, no coat, no Bible, nothing. Only the cracked pulpit remained standing like an altar left for no God. Then dawn came and the battle raged. Men who had heard his sermon fell in droves, scattered across the fields of Gettysburg. Survivors swore they heard his words echoing in their ears even as the cannons roared. This land drinks blood, and it will never be full. The fields drank deeply that day, and yet, as he had said, they remained thirsty. When the battle ended, the preacher was nowhere to be found. No soldier, Union or Confederate, ever reported his presence again. It was as though the mist had swallowed him forever. Some said he had returned to heaven. Others said to hell. Some believed he had finally given himself to the land he preached of, that he had stepped into eternity, itself leaving only the legend behind. Historians searched but found no record of his name, no chaplain unaccounted for, no minister lost in the war. Diaries spoke of him, letters whispered of him, but nothing official bore his mark. He existed only in memory, only in story. And yet those who had heard him swore he was real. They swore they had felt his words in their very bones. They swore the phantom preacher had walked among them. And so his legend sealed at Gettysburg, at the edge of a ruined church, with a final sermon that rang louder than any cannon. This land drinks blood, and it will never be full. And with those words he stepped into mist and was gone. That night, the regiment he preached to was nearly wiped out. The fields became a sea of broken bodies, their cries fading into silence as the guns thundered and the smoke thickened. The storm rolled across the hills, swallowing the sound of life, until only the moan of the wounded remained. Men who had once sat listening to that fiery voice now lay still, staring at the black sky as if waiting for an answer that never came. The preacher had warned them, and then vanished, and it seemed the land itself had obeyed his command. When the sun at last broke through the smoke, the few who lived staggered back to the ruined church, desperate for shelter, desperate for meaning, desperate for proof that he had been real. Some swore they had followed his figure into the mist, that they saw the tattered edge of his coat vanish into the night, but now in the light of day there was nothing left. They searched every corner of the broken sanctuary, turning over stones, pulling apart the rotting pews, hoping for the scent of him. A footprint, a discarded Bible, a scrap of cloth. But there was nothing, only dust and silence. The pulpit still stood leaning and cracked, its wood splintered as though split by lightning. The survivors gathered before it, some touching its surface with trembling fingers as if it held some trace of him. One swore the wood was warm to the touch, though the morning was bitterly cold. Another swore he felt a vibration in the grain, as if the last echoes of his sermon still lived there, thrumming faintly like a heartbeat. But when the others touched it, they felt only dead wood and splinters. Whispers filled the air. One man claimed the preacher had not been a man at all, but an angel of death sent to claim them. Another spat and swore it was the devil himself, preaching lies to lead them to slaughter. Others said nothing, staring only at the empty pulpit with eyes that could not forget what they had heard. One soldier dropped to his knees in the rubble, praying for forgiveness, though none could say for what. Another began to laugh a broken laugh that rose and cracked like shattered glass until the others dragged him away. As night fell again, the survivors huddled by the church, some too weak to move, some too shaken to leave. They swore they heard footsteps echoing on the stone floor inside, though no one was there. They swore they heard faint murmurs of a voice whispering scripture or curses, or both. One claimed he saw a shadow step across the pulpit, though no body cast it. Another swore he smelled smoke like the brimstone of hell, rising from the cracks in the stone. No one slept that night, each man staring into the darkness, half expecting the preacher to return and finish what he had started, half hoping he would come back to explain who he was and why death always followed him. But the ruins remained empty, silent except for the moan of the wind through broken glass, the pulpit standing alone as if guarding its secret in. The days that followed, word spread through the ranks. Men who had not seen him swore they had heard of him from their brothers. Men spoke in hushed tones around the campfires of the phantom preacher who walked into mist and left only death behind. The story spread faster than any marching column, carried from mouth to mouth like a warning, or perhaps a curse. Yet no one could ever agree on what he looked like. Some said he was gaunt, his face hollow, his skin pale as bone. Others swore his eyes burned brighter than fire. Some claimed his Bible bore no words, only blank pages that filled when he spoke. Others said it dripped blood when he read aloud, each tale twisted by fear, each soldier adding what he thought he saw, until the man became less human, more myth. But those who had stood in that ruined church, those who had felt the floor tremble beneath his words, knew there had been something real, something that left them changed. They could not say if he was man or ghost, prophet or curse, only that after he spoke the regiment was nearly gone, and that where he had stood there remained no proof, no tracks, no coat, no Bible, only the cracked pulpit staring back at them like a grave marker with no name. And in the silence of that place the men began to wonder if the preacher had ever truly walked among them at all, or if he was the voice of the land itself, hungry, unending, calling them to their fate. Years later, when the war had ended and the land tried to heal, when fields once soaked in blood grew green again with crops, and towns rebuilt their walls, when children played where men had fallen, the stories of the phantom preacher did not fade. Instead, they grew for the veterans who survived, carried something heavier than their scars. They carried the memory of that voice. Some swore they saw him again, years after the last cannon had fired, a thin figure standing alone at the edge of a field where weeds had swallowed trenches, they claimed. He was there when the mist rolled in near abandoned churches where the bells had long since fallen silent. His coat hanging loose, his face shadowed, his eyes still burning with that same terrible fire. They would freeze in their tracks, afraid to approach, for, though they longed to ask who he was, their legs refused to move, as if the earth itself held them in place. Others told of hearing his voice in the wind, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, and then rising like thunder, reciting lines that they knew by heart, not because they wanted to, but because they could never forget them. The same words that had haunted them since the war, phrases burned into their minds. Blood sacrifice, eternity. One veteran wrote that when he heard the whisper in the wind, his bones turned cold and his hands shook so hard he dropped the lantern he was carrying. Diaries from old soldiers recorded the same uncanny details. Men who had not seen one another in decades wrote the same phrases, as if dictated by some unseen hand, words that had once been spoken to them before battle, words that always came before death. They wrote of waking in the night drenched in sweat, convinced they had heard the preacher standing at the foot of their bed reciting the same lines. His voice calm, steady, merciless. Some veterans went mad, haunted by his memory. Their families said they would wake screaming sermons into the dark, their eyes wide and unseeing, their voices not their own, as if something spoke through them. Others wasted away, claiming the preacher had marked them long ago, and that death was following, slow but certain. But the strangest tales came from those who swore the preacher still appeared before death. Not just on battlefields, but in quiet towns and lonely roads. One soldier turned. Farmer swore that on the night his child died of fever, he heard the preacher whisper outside his home. He dared not open the door, but he heard the words, clear as bells. This land drinks blood, and it will never be full. Another man, dying in his bed, swore he saw the gaunt figure in the corner of his room nodding once before vanishing. As his final breath left him, villagers near Gettysburg whispered that the ruins of that church were still cursed. They claimed that on stormy nights you could hear a voice rise above the thunder, speaking words no living man would dare repeat. Travelers who passed by swore they saw a figure in the mist, watching them with eyes that gleamed in the darkness. But when they called out, no answer, came only silence. And as the years stretched on, as the veterans grew old and the war became history, the stories of the phantom preacher refused to die. Young men who had never fought swore they saw him too. That same gaunt frame, that same fiery gaze, they asked the old soldiers to explain. But the veterans would only shake their heads, their faces pale, for they had spent their lives trying to forget. So the legend lived not in books or monuments, but in whispers, carried from campfires to taverns, from porches to graveyards. A name never written but always remembered, a shadow at the edge of memory, a voice in the wind. Some called him a prophet, some called him a curse. Others swore he was no man at all, but something older, something bound to the soil, something that walked only where death was near. And though time buried the war beneath history, the preacher's story refused to stay buried. For the words were never forgotten, and even in silence, even in peace, there were those who swore they could still hear him. Historians argue still to this day, their voices filling lecture halls and dusty archives. They ask, was he a desperate pastor lost in the confusion of war? A man who tried to cling to his faith in a world of fire and death? A preacher who wandered too far into places no sermon could redeem? Or was he a spy, some hidden hand moving between Union and Confederate camps, passing unseen with words of scripture as his disguise, a man so skilled in deception that no bullet found him and no soldier questioned him until it was too late? Yet there is a darker possibility, one that scholars rarely write but whisper only when lamps burn low. Perhaps he was not a man at all, but a phantom, tied to the blood-soaked soil of 1863, a spirit born from slaughter, a shadow that fed on fear and suffering. For every story that survives tells of his arrival before death, never after, always just before. Like a bell tolling a curse, he could not be touched by musket or blade, and when men searched for his tracks, there were none. When they sought his name, there was silence. When they asked each other who had first seen him, none could answer. The records remain strange and broken letters written by officers who never spoke again, diaries that end with a line describing the preacher, before the ink trails into nothingness, chaplains who refuse to comment, except to say that evil sometimes wears the mask of holiness. One Union officer wrote, in 1864, if this preacher be a man, then he is a man who has bargained away his soul. If he be a spirit, then he is bound to the carnage itself, for wherever he walks. Graves soon follow. Generations later, the questions remain, and the sightings do too. Travelers near old battlefields claim to see a thin figure at dusk, his outline faint against the horizon, always near the ruins of churches or fields where the dead had been left unnamed. Local farmers whisper that when the mist rolls low, they hear a sermon carried on the wind, words that no one dares repeat, for they chill the blood and leave even the bravest men unable to sleep. Historians debate but never agree. Some insist he was only myth, a tale created by terrified soldiers, desperate to make sense of chaos. Others argue that too many independent reports, too many identical phrases scrawled in separate diaries, prove there was something more, something unexplained. But the veterans who lived and saw and heard never argued to them. He was real, too real. They carried him to their graves, and perhaps that is the truest terror, that the phantom preacher of 1863 was not bound to one side or one belief, but to the war itself, that he was not blessing nor cursing, but simply bearing witness, feeding on the endless tide of sacrifice and eternity. And if that is true, then he may never have left at all. His words may still linger in the soil, his shadow may still walk in the fog, and perhaps somewhere tonight as the wind cuts through broken steeples you might hear him too, whispering the same words the soldiers never forgot. This land drinks blood and it will never be full. To this day, the land has not forgotten, and neither have the people who live near the old fields of slaughter. They whisper of a preacher who still walks before storms, his gaunt frame glimpsed in the rolling mist, his voice echoing through ruined chapels where the bells no longer ring, but the stones themselves seem to tremble when the wind carries his words. Farmers working late in the fields say they hear faint sermons rising with the thunder, and they hurry indoors before the rain falls. For they know what comes with the storm. Travelers tell of wandering into abandoned churches, their doors long rotted, their windows shattered, only to hear a voice speaking from the shadows, a sermon without end. When they light their lanterns, the pews stand empty. Yet the voice continues, calm, steady, relentless. Some swear they see a figure at the pulpit, thin as a skeleton, his hands clutching a Bible that is never opened, his eyes burning like coals, and then the light flickers and he is gone, leaving only silence that weighs heavier than the air. Whether man or spirit, no one can agree. Some insist he was a pastor, driven mad by war, unable to leave the fields of the dead. Others whisper he was never a man at all, but something older, something called forth by the blood of thousands, something that feeds on memory and fear. Yet one truth remains unbroken in every telling wherever the phantom preacher walked. Death always followed and still follows. And so the legend endures, woven into the soil of 1863, lingering in the ruined steeples carved into the minds of those who claim to hear him. Still he is not bound to the past, for his words rise whenever men gather in the shadow of violence. His sermons are not forgotten, they are waiting, whispered in the dark, carried in the wind, echoing through places where prayers are no longer answered. To this day, the phantom preacher stands between history and nightmare, a figure half remembered, half feared. Perhaps he is still walking now, perhaps. He waits for the next storm, and if you stand too close to the old battlefields, if you listen when the thunder rolls, you may hear him too. His voice low and steady, warning you that this land drinks blood and it will never be full.